Alright, and we are live. So I'm going to be responding to a video from Capturing Christianity because I take it that it's going to be sort of like a fad, or at least I have been observing that it kind of is a fad in sort of counter-apologetic circles, sort of atheist philosophy sort of channels, Phil Rail YouTube, you might say. Um, um, yeah, a lot of people tend to like responding to Capturing Christianity. Seems to be a sort of popular thing that a lot of the cool kids do these days. So might as well join in the fad because why not? I already have like a couple of response videos up. So the video I'll be responding to is why no one should deconvert, featuring Apologetic Squared, and um, um, I guess it's kind of misleading to say that I'm responding to a Capturing Christianity video, since who I'm actually going to be responding to is Apologetic Squared himself. Where, because this is a video where he presents sort of a novel sort of argument. It's going to be an argument that um, Christians can never be warranted in sort of deconverting from Christianity because, well, we'll see his specific argument later, but basically the idea is going to be that Christians can never be. Once you accept Christian theism, there's no way out. At least once you accept Christian theism. Um, you can only um, begin to reject it on pain of sort of irrationality. So that's going to be sort of the basic idea um, of the argument. And um, the argument he gave was sort of an interesting one, and it made me ponder on it a bit. It forced me to sort of think about it a bit and deliberate. But the result of my deliberation, in the end, was that I came to the conclusion that the argument is unsound. It doesn't work. It's unsound. And I'll be happy to explain why in my review of this video, um, which I'm going to start now.
No one should ever deconvert from Christianity. I was trying to make this like super epic beginning to the stream, and I just failed at it. But today I've got Apologetic Squared with me, who's he's kind of provocative in some of the stuff that he does. Well, welcome to the stream, first of all. It's great to have you here.
Hello,
So
thank you. Thanks for having me.
you know, I have it on 2x speed, so we can get through this faster.
Hi.
Hi, yeah, we're going to do a face reveal actually in just a second, but let's talk a little bit about what the topic of this stream is about. And the topic is no one should ever deconvert from Christianity. Kind of a provocative title, just slightly provocative, but that's kind of like it's kind of your style, right? Like if you look at, by the way, I've got his channel linked in the description if you guys want to go see and check out more of his work. But that's kind of like what you do. You're very provocative in the way that you say things. Like one of your videos that a lot of atheists picked up on was should atheists delete their channels, which is
So I actually have watched that video. He sort of gives a sort of Pascalian inspired argument for why atheists should delete their channels. It's an interesting one. I might do a stream responding to that video. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But my purpose here isn't going to be to respond to that video. It's going to be to respond to the sort of argument he presents here.
a very provocative question.
See, the way I look at it is like whenever I get into like epistemology more so, like Christianity is a really radical kind of belief system, if you want to phrase it that way, at least in some sense. And so then like the correct epistemological response to that is it's not going to be radical. So then whenever I try and do anything in epistemology, it gets like super inflammatory to certain audiences. And like that's not my intention. I'm just trying to do epistemology, but yeah, that's kind of how things go. At least that's the way I see it.
Yeah, I think you're doing more than that, though. I mean, there's a reason why you're picking these titles, like should atheists delete their channel. So have you, is that something that just like, do these ideas just come to you, or are you like actively working on something and you're like, how can I make this super provocative, or do these provocative ideas just like happen?
Well, so for the Pascal's wager one, it was mostly like in response to like this kind like I was thinking about the kind of objection to Pascal's wager that you can't really like you don't have the ability to convert even if.
So he's talking about Pascal's Ranger right now. Pascal's Ranger. What the fuck am I talking? Pascal's wager. So I suppose I'll explain why I don't think that Pascal's wager type considerations are convincing, and why I don't think Pascal's wager is a particularly good argument. And this consideration isn't going to be the sort of reason I don't think Pascal's wager is successful isn't going to be one that applies to his specific video that he's talking about right now, but regardless, I think it's going to be useful for me to sort of outline why I don't think it's convincing. And the reason why is is sort of deontological. I subscribe to a sort of epistemic deontology wherein we have epistemic duties, um, and our strongest overriding epistemic duty is going to be that we ought to believe things that we think are true, or at least that we think are likely to be true. And I think that yeah, I think that that sort of epistemic sort of norm. I just take that to just be a sort of epistemic norm, and I think that yeah, that when you appeal to sort of beneficial reasons or prudential reasons, we might say, um, those aren't going to be really motivating for me when it comes to beliefs, because I think that um, um, sort of the deontological rules of epistemology that I accept sort of um, will command me to not sort of believe things due to reasons related to like beneficial reasons and prudential reasons, right? Because I think that it's going to be a sort of deontological rule that I ought to believe things that are true. Another way we can sort of attack this sort of view is by appealing to something like epistemic constitutivism, which is going to be something like the view that the proper aim of belief, the constitutive aim of belief, is truth. So that when we sort of have beliefs which don't aim at truth, we're sort of failing to exemplify the sort of proper aim of belief, because that's just what beliefs are. They're constitutive of what a belief even is that it aims at truth. It's the constitutive aim, right? So that's another approach we could take, that we're just sort of failing to exemplify the proper aim of belief. But my personal view is that I prefer sort of like a deontological road, where I affirm certain epistemic norms, which, given that I affirm these epistemic norms, it's never going to be the case that I'm going to be motivated to believe things on the basis of beneficial reasons. Seems like that's going to be something that I reject from the gate. So it's going to be something. The reason why I think Pascal's wager fails. I guess if you're some type of virtue epistemologist, you might have a sort of we might accept that beneficial reasons can be a good reason to accept beliefs. But I don't think this is going to be a way to save the Pascalian, because if anything, it seems to me if a virtue epistemology is willing to allow people to believe things purely on the basis of beneficial reasons, it seems to me that that's going to be a significant count against virtue epistemology. It seems to me that if we allow people to believe things on the basis of beneficial reasons, it seems to me that we're just going to be creating sort of bad epistemic agents, bad agents who are good, who are sort of bad with respect to understanding the truth. So I'm just not convinced by Pascal's wager. I just don't think Pascal's wager type considerations are convincing, and that's sort of the reason why.
Even if you grant that Christianity has this infinite expected utility. And I was thinking about that. I'm like, okay, so you're like granting, like, if you could convert to Christianity, that would be like an infinite gain, but you can't do that. And there's other ways that should affect your life besides just converting, because infinite expected utility, that's a pretty big deal. So I thought that it was missing the point of the wager to be like, yes, I'm granting that like this Christianity thing is like infinitely important. I'm just going to ignore it because I can't convert. Well, there are other things you could do as well. And I just was thinking about, okay, what other things could you do? And I'm a YouTuber, I have a YouTube channel. I think about interacting with atheist YouTube channels. That's how I thought, okay, maybe that's something that would promote infinite expected utility. That was kind of the thought process for that. And you do want to like create a title that people will click on, but I'm not. Yeah. It's kind of unfortunate because you're balancing like you want people to watch it, but you're not looking to get people mad. But usually those things overlap quite a bit.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so let's go ahead and do the face reveal. Actually, before we do that, let me let people know about some free resources that we've got available for.
So he's going to be advertising his book, which I have no interest in. Let's just skip that.
Face reveal. I think.
So we're about to do the sort of face reveal for the Apologetic Squared. Let's see what he looks like.
I think a lot of people online are excited to see your face for the first time. So why don't we go ahead and do that? Are you ready?
Yeah. Hello.
All right, let's do it. There it is.
Hi. Yeah.
So that's what he looks like. He's I mean, I don't really have many comments on his appearance, other than his face kind of like, you can almost like see how it's like a square, almost like you can see how it's kind of like block-like, which is kind of interesting. Unfortunately, there isn't really a bookshelf for me to like sort of look at. Usually when these guys come on, they have like a big bookshelf behind them, but it's possible he has a bookshelf, but this whiteboard he has here is covering it. In any case, I don't really have much to say about him, other than he's just sort of an average-looking white dude.
This is Apologetic Squared. Okay. Your head is kind of squarish. Just to say, like, it does kind of look your face shape is more square than oval. So that's okay. I don't know if that was intentional or it just happened that way. But
it was originally a math pun, actually. I just like math, so Apologetic Squared. But then I'm like, hey, I could draw stick with a square head.
Yeah, no, it's good. I really like it. I think it's I don't want to call it cute, but it is cute. All right, so let's get to the argument. Okay, so what is this? Why should no one deconvert from Christianity?
Okay, so before I get like straight into the argument, I do want to provide like, a little bit of a disclaimer, right? Because like
Okay.
some apologists, they have like this reputation not using as arguments in philosophy to like get the truth, but to like whack somebody over the head with and say, "Aha, you godless heathen! I'm so much more rational than you." And like if you just saw like the thumbnail of this video, the title of it, you probably think that that's what this apologetic square guy's doing, right? He's just going to go out there and try and show how much more rational he is than everybody else. No, that's not my goal here. That's not my intention. Rather, I have this argument with premises that, at least by my lights, seem obviously true premises, but it leads to a conclusion which sounds crazy. I mean, I'm going to be like really upfront about the conclusion of this argument does sound crazy. Like the argument entails that even if you're like presented with the corpse of Jesus, in that scenario, you should not deconvert. Which, that sounds kind of weird. So what you, the viewer, have the ability to do is either like accept this crazy conclusion or reject these premises that look obviously true. And either way, you're going to gain something valuable. You're going to gain something valuable. You're going to learn
value.
That's value, not a valuable. Yeah. Anyways, philosophy.
So
Yeah.
I appreciate the sort of preliminary remarks here that he's not trying to beat people over the head. He's not trying to expose atheism as sort of irrational. He did say that by his lights, the premises are obviously true, but it seems like he's allowing for a sort of level of epistemic permissivism. Like he sort of at some level seems to acknowledge that well, for him the premises are going to be true. It's not going to be the case. It's like there's going to be some room for reasonable disagreement. It's not going to be obviously true for atheists. And in fact, by my lights, the premises are far from obviously true, and I actually think the argument seems almost obviously unsound. But in any case, I do appreciate like the sort of preliminary remarks here, and I do think that that's the sort of a sign of good faith. And I do appreciate that. It feels like sort of bad that I even have to sort of commend him for this but I guess that sort of like a goes to show the sort of state of discourse in sort of online circles, even online sort of sophisticated philosophy circles. Um, we get a lot of sort of bad faith. Maybe this is just me being cynical, and maybe I'm just hardened by sort of my experiences on my various platforms on Twitter and Reddit. But it seems to me that good faith is hard to come by. So um, this sort of thing is sort of, I guess, worth praising.
That's the gist of it. And another
Yeah, I think
note,
that's. Yeah, I think that's fair because like that's the whole goal of what you're trying to do here is you're trying to give these like this argument which has premises that lead to a conclusion, and the conclusion is what the title of this video is all about. Like no one should ever. So that's the conclusion of the argument. But along the way, you could instead of accept the conclusion, you could reject some of the premises. But the issue and why it's so interesting is that the premises just seem true, and that's what makes this really interesting.
Yeah. Like, and another quick note before getting into the argument is that this isn't about like the psychology of deconversion at all. I haven't like studied the literature on that, and I myself have no experience with deconverting, haven't done it before. This is more just like a philosophical discussion about like the interplay between like our beliefs and our obligations. Anyways, enough disclaimers. Let's get to like the actual philosophy. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Should I make you full screen so you can start writing on your whiteboard there?
This whiteboard is more like just a backup. If I'm having difficulty explaining something, I can like draw something because that's as you can see by my child, that's kind of the way I explain things. But like, yeah, I don't need full screen right now. I can just talk. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So we have obligations, right? Kind of like moral obligations are one example of sort of obligation that we have. We have like you ought not lie, you ought not steal, you ought not cheat. Those are moral obligations that we all have. But it's not the only kind of obligation that we have. We also have this other kind of obligation called epistemic obligations. These are obligations more about like rationality and knowledge and that kind of thing. Like you ought to follow evidence where it leads. You ought to avoid false beliefs. If you accept the premises of a valid argument.
So he's explaining the difference between epistemic obligations and moral obligations here. So, and this is important. But first off, I think what's worth saying is that if one is in a limitivist about moral and epistemic reasons, if one is like some sort of like a error theorist or something, or even if there are some, they take a sort of a non-cognitivist approach to epistemic, and it's just like sort of an expressivist approach, even. This argument is going to be like sort of dead on arrival for them because like it's just not going to be the case that they have epistemic reasons and moral reasons at all, and we're going to see that this argument sort of heavily relies on there being these epistemic and moral reasons, which are like real, which of course an error theorist is going to deny, or any kind of moral anti-realist, epistemic anti-realist is going to deny. So, in that case, yeah, that's one thing that's worth pointing out. For the epistemic anti-realist and the moral anti-realist, this argument is going to not going to be particularly compelling for them, or I should say it's not going to be compelling for them at all because it's just the first premise there is not going to be one that they accept. In any case, we're just going to assume from this point that moral realism and epistemic anti-realism is true, and I'm actually fine with that because, I think epistemic anti-realism is just sort of ridiculous, and I think moral realism is correct as well. So what was I going to say? Okay, yeah. He's carving out sort of what the distinction between epistemic reasons and moral reasons are, and I have no problem with the way he explained it. Um, but I would just add another useful way to think about it is that epistemic reasons are going to be those reasons which are belief guiding, and moral reasons are those reasons which are action guiding. So epistemic norms are action guiding, belief guiding norms, and moral norms are action guiding norms, right? And that's going to be an important distinction to realize. So and then obviously, we can think of some examples of belief guiding norms, such as epistemic norms, which is going to be stuff like following proper instance rules, like modus ponens, modus tollens, right? Following proper instinct, yeah, like deductive validity, sort of truth tables, that kind of thing. And then we have we have some the Humean vice, the typical like wise words of David Hume, which is we should proportion our belief to the evidence. That's going to be another sort of epistemic norm, which is yeah. So basically, that's the idea. Epistemic norms are belief guiding, right? And and he listed off some examples of moral norms, which is going to be like the norm to sort of avoid lying. We ought not murder. We ought not lie. It's going to be. I think we all understand what moral norms are. Just wanted to clarify epistemic norms since they're slightly more obscure, and you need to be a little bit more familiar with philosophy to understand them. So, but I have no problem with the way he carved out the distinction. But I think the way I explained it is going to be something that's going to become useful in terms of the way he motivates his argument. And we'll see in a minute, which we'll see in a minute.
Argument, you ought to accept the argument's conclusion. These are all obligations. These are all oughts that you have, but they're not really moral in a sense. Like you could have like a morally good idiot who follows all their moral obligations, but none of their epistemic obligations. Or you could have like a really immoral psychopath or sadist or whatever who follows all their oh wait, no, sorry,
Epistemic. Yeah, no, you're right.
Immoral
You're
genius. An immoral genius.
Okay.
Yeah, an immoral genius who follows all their epistemic obligations, but none of their moral obligations. But like we don't want to be morally good idiots, nor do we want to be immoral geniuses. We want to be morally good geniuses if we can. Or that is to say, we want to follow all of our moral obligations and all of our epistemic obligations. We want to follow both as much as we can at the same time. But there are scenarios where you can't, where you have to choose because your moral obligations tell you to go one way, and your epistemic obligations tell you to go another way.
So this is where I think he starts saying stuff that is really questionable, because remember how I explained how moral norms are just going to be those norms which are which are action guiding, and epistemic norms are going to be those norms which are belief guiding, right? So it seems to me unclear how epistemic norms are going to count against moral norms, because it seems to me that epistemic norms aren't even about the same kind of thing that moral norms are about. They don't guide actions, right? How can a non-action guiding norm count against a moral norm? And he's going to give a sort of example. He Once I click play on here, he's going to give an example, and let's see if it's any good.
So what do you do in those scenarios? Like an example of a thought experiment where your moral and your epistemic obligations go in different directions. This was given originally by Liz Jackson. She's been on the channel before. She's cool. It's this thought
I'm just going to go ahead and
experiment.
make it full screen just in case you want to use your whiteboard here.
Okay. With like the truth-hating mafia. Okay. The truth-hating mafia. They're this mafia. They hate the truth. Actually, now that I think about it, that's pretty redundant. You probably figured it out. Yeah. Anyways, the truth-hating mafia. They hate the truth, and they're a mafia, and they kidnap your family, and they say, we're going to do all sorts of nasty things to your family and make them suffer unless you take this pill, okay? And this pill, it'll make you think that the millionth digit of pi is 7. It isn't. Like the millionth digit of pi, I think it's 1. It's not 7. So taking this pill will give you a false belief, which they want because of the truth-hating mafia. So what do you do in that scenario? Like, well, let's consult our obligations and see what they have to say. Your epistemic obligations say you ought to avoid false beliefs, and therefore you ought to avoid taking this pill. So let your family suffer. Like that's what rationality says. On the other hand, your moral obligations say take the pill. Your family needs you. And so this is a scenario where epistemic obligations say one thing, moral obligations say another thing.
So he's giving this as a sort of example of where epistemic obligations and moral obligations conflict. So it's going to be really key here to understand how it is that moral obligations and epistemic obligations can conflict here. And there's sort of going to be a bunch of reasons to interpret how the conflict could arise. Because the question is going to be how is it that moral norms, which are norms about how we ought to act, how is it that they can how is it that moral norms, which are about how we ought to act, can conflict with epistemic norms, which guide our like sort of belief forming methods that we ought to use. Because moral norms are strictly action guiding and epistemic norms are strictly belief guiding. So how could they be in conflict? It doesn't seem like bare epistemic reasons can weigh against moral reasons, because considerations about sort of what propositions I ought to believe don't factor in how I ought to act. That doesn't seem like the case anyways, unless they don't like. It doesn't seem to me that the propositions I believe factor into how I ought to act. That is, unless I hold a sort of moral maxim on which I always ought to act in such a way as to maximize true beliefs. But that would be a sort of a moral norm, not an epistemic norm, um, right? Because a maxim is sort of like um, a thing you take which guides actions, right? It's going to be a sort of action guiding sort of situation. It's not going to be an epistemic norm. Um, uh, Sorry, I'm really tired right now. It's like fucking it's 1:30. And I had an 8-hour shift today, so you'll have to forgive me if I'm sort of inarticulate here. In any case, um, yeah, it doesn't seem like bare epistemic reasons can weigh against moral reasons unless you have a further belief that there's this maxim on which we have to maximize true beliefs, right? That's basically what my point is. And additionally, in the scenario he outlined, it doesn't seem that the epistemic reasons count against my taking the pill either, because taking the pill is an action; it's not a belief, right? Epistemic norms aren't action guiding, right? They're not action guiding. Seems to me that we would only be violating epistemic norms if we had the belief that we ought to take the pill, and that belief was false. That would be the condition under which um, we would be violating a sort of epistemic norm, right? Because otherwise, if we're just acting, it's not the case that we have like a false belief there. Um, so I take it that maybe he's saying that we're violating our epistemic norms because our epistemic norms tell us we should always act in such a way that would result in us gaining true beliefs. But this seems false, right? Because it doesn't seem that epistemic norms enter into the domain of action at all, right? So long as I have no false beliefs, it doesn't seem like any epistemic norm is being violated, right? Because that's all epistemic norms are. They're epistemic norms. They're norms which are designed such that we want to avoid having false beliefs. It doesn't have to do with action at all. Um, and but even further than that, it seems fine to me that we can have epistemic reasons for believing certain propositions. Um, for example, it seems to me that we can have the epistemic reason to believe the proposition that we ought to act in such and such a way, or such and such a way entails having a false belief. Because remember, epistemic norms just tell us our epistemic duties to believe things, right, that are true. And it may well turn out to be a true belief, or at least we may be justified or take ourselves to be justified in believing it's true. Um, that there are actions that, all things considered, we must perform, even if they lead to false beliefs, right? We can believe it's true, right, that we ought to perform such actions. And so, in having that belief, we would be succeeding with respect to our epistemic norms, not failing, right? We would be succeeding because it's true that we ought to perform certain actions. It's going to be, we can say it's a moral fact, right, that we ought to perform certain actions, and we have that belief. So what we're doing is we're actually in sync with our epistemic norms. We're believing a true moral fact, right? We're not failing with respect to the standard that epistemic norms set. So another way to think about it is maybe he thinks that epistemic norms provide sort of pro tanto reasons to act in a certain way. So that epistemic norms provide um, sort of pro tanto reasons to act in such a way that increases our disposition to obey epistemic norms, or to have to be put in situations where we have true beliefs, or that we're less likely to form false beliefs, right? Is basically what he might be saying. That there's this pro tanto reason here. And if that's what he's saying, that's fine. But it seems to me that that's a conflict between epistemic norms. It's not a conflict between epistemic norms and moral norms, right? It seems to me that that's a conflict between these weaker pro tanto reasons and then moral norms. But it seems possible to me that moral considerations are always going to be outweighing considerations. It seems to me that moral reasons are always going to outweigh these weaker pro tanto reasons. I would think this isn't even controversial, right? Because the overridingness of sort of moral obligations is going to be something that's well accepted amongst most normative ethicists. So it seems to me that no matter how we think of the conflict here, doesn't turn out to be true in any sense that there are these epistemic norms which count against the moral norms, even in the case of his truth hating mob case, right? Because in that case, it's not the case that that uh, just because we have a moral obligation to take the pill. It's not that the epistemic obligation counts against that. What's happening there is that both obligations are in effect, right? We have the moral obligation to take the pill because of these moral reasons, and then once we take the pill, it's going to still be the case that we have the epistemic obligation to believe that to not believe that the millionth digit of pi is 7, right? That epistemic obligation doesn't go away, right? It's still going to be the case that we have that epistemic obligation. But so what's going to happen there is we fulfill our moral obligation, and then once we take the pill, um, we fail with respect to our epistemic obligation. So it's not the case that the epistemic obligation is one that weighs against the moral obligation, because epistemic obligations don't factor into how we should take certain actions anyways, right? Just the bare epistemic obligation doesn't really tell me what to do in a given situation at all. It just tells me what beliefs I should have, right? And the only way that there can be any sort of conflict here is if we take it that epistemic reasons provide sort of pro tanto reasons to have certain dispositions with regards to following certain belief forming processes, such as proper rules of inference in such and such ways, such and such, whatever. And yeah, that seems to me to be the issue at stake here. It doesn't seem to me that there's a real conflict between epistemic norms and moral norms, and this is going to be a problem for him because a lot of what his argument relies on is that there's going to be um, a conflict here, and then once there's this conflict, we always go by what's stronger. Is the moral norm stronger than the epistemic norm, or is the epistemic norm stronger than the moral norm? That's the way he's thinking about this here, right? And I'm saying that this is the wrong way to think about this, and the correct way to think about this, I would say, is that moral norms are going to be those norms which are always overriding in the case of action, right? That's just what moral norms are. They're just overriding sort of action guiding norms. And any pro tanto reason is going to be sort of nothing against a moral norm in terms of like deliberating what sort of action we should take. But then when it comes to epistemic norms are going to be overriding norms in terms of what beliefs we should have, right? So there's any consideration that goes against epistemic norms is going to be moot in terms of our beliefs, right? Because epistemic norms are just those norms which are overriding in terms of our belief, in terms of like how we should form our beliefs and our belief structure, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope you're tracking the reason here. I might not be most articulate right now because I'm extremely exhausted. I haven't had a cup of coffee, and it's fucking 1 o'clock, and I had a long day at work. So if I'm not the most articulate right now, excuse me, but I hope you're tracking the reason here, right? Doesn't seem that there's a real conflict here, and it seems to me that we should think of it this way, that moral norms are overriding in terms of action, and epistemic norms are overriding in terms of belief.
What do? Do we just throw our hands up in the air? It's like, oh, our obligations are contradicting each other. There's no tiebreaker, so we're just gonna throw our hands in the air. Who knows what to do? No, I think that it's pretty clear what we do in this scenario. I myself at least believe that my moral obligation towards my family in this context outweighs my epistemic obligation towards having true beliefs. And if you do believe that, then you should take the pill. So from that, I think you could like derive a principle. Like we're going to go from this scenario where we go with our moral obligations over epistemic obligations to a more general principle about what you should do. We call it the obligation principle. I actually did write it down on the board behind this guy. Okay.
So he's assuming that we need this obligation principle, wherein when we deliberate which obligation we should do, it's always going to be like the stronger obligation. So there's going to be conflictions between our epistemic obligations and our moral obligations, and when we have these conflicts, we should always go with the greatest obligation. But it seems to me false, right? Because it's not going to be the case that the epistemic obligation conflicts with the moral obligation, right? It's not the case that in the truth-seeking mob case, it seems to me that the epistemic obligation is still there even after you take the pill, right? It's just that you're failing with respect to your epistemic obligation. So what in the case of the truth-seeking mob, the correct answer there would be that we ought to take the pill, and we ought to believe that we ought not believe that the millionth digit of pi is 7, right? So both those obligations are fully active there, and they don't count against each other, right? And yeah, that's basically what I say. Like, just because we have this moral obligation, it doesn't make the sort of epistemic obligation go away, right? It's still going to sort of be there, right? And the moral obligation doesn't like sort of count against it and override it, right? That's not even like that's not what's happening at all.
Yeah. You should do what you believe is your great. I don't know if you can see that. It's yeah.
I can see it well enough. It just says, do what you believe is your greatest obligation.
Yeah, I'm gonna call that the obligation principle right over there. So do whatever you think is your greatest obligation. Now, this principle, it's what does most of the heavy lifting in this argument. Okay, it has some radical implications if you accept this kind of obligation principle. You do whatever your greatest obligation is. Like the moral obligation in that scenario, it seemed greater than your epistemic obligation. It seemed like weightier, so you went with it. But this principle here, I have another thing prepared to like kind of illustrate how this principle can lead to some weird conclusions. So here's a paper, and on it I've written your greatest obligation is to believe everything written on this paper. Okay, and we'll imagine Jim. Jim is this agent who follows the obligation principle, and he comes to believe that what's written on this paper is true. He believes that his greatest obligation is in fact to believe everything written on this paper. Okay. So then, how's Jim going to live his life? Well, he's going to live his life working very hard to make sure he continues to believe what's written on this paper, because that's his greatest obligation, right? So, Jim...
And that's what he believes.
Yeah, that's what he believes. So then, because he believes that that's his greatest obligation, then he's going to spend more time working to believe the paper, which solidifies that that's his belief that that's his greatest obligation, which solidifies that he's going to spend more time trying to believe it. Like, it's this kind of loop. His belief anchors him into believing it. And then, what if we come along and we're like, Jim, this paper is ridiculous. You shouldn't be following it. Like, here's all these arguments and evidence that your greatest obligation is in fact not to believe this paper. It's something else. Well, Jim's going to say, well, interesting point there. What you've shown is that there's evidence against believing what's on this paper. So you give me an epistemic obligation to stop believing what's written on this paper. However, I also believe what the paper says. And it says that my greatest obligation is to believe everything written on this paper. So we have epistemic obligation versus this paper's obligation. And this is greater, so I'm going to go with the paper rather than my epistemic obligations.
So what he's saying is that there can be this greatest obligation which outweighs any sort of epistemic obligations. But it seems to me that once we understand epistemic obligations the way I do, which is to say that epistemic obligations are those obligations which are overriding in terms of our belief structure, in terms of like how we ought to acquiesce or they're overriding obligations in terms of the acquisition of our beliefs, right? That's just what they are. That's just how I understand what epistemic obligations are, right? So it seems to me then, on this sort of view, it seems to me that what he's saying here is just incoherent, right? Because he's sort of like failing to realize this, or failing to fully appreciate the sort of overriding normative force of epistemic reasons, right? It can't be the case that you have a greatest obligation that overrides all epistemic norms, because epistemic norms just are those norms which are overriding in terms of what beliefs you ought to have, right? That's just what an epistemic norm is, and it's just going to be an overriding belief. It's just going to be an overriding norm that you ought to avoid having false beliefs, and you ought to follow sort of proper rules of inference, right? That's going to be a sort of overriding norm that well, those are going to be examples of epistemic norms which are overriding in the case of belief acquisition, right? So it seems to me that if he wants to say that that there's a possibility for this greatest possible obligation that overrides all epistemic norms, it seems to me that's just conceptually confused, right? Because you're failing to realize that what an epistemic norm is it just is those norms which are just outweighing in terms of what the structure of your beliefs ought to be, and how you what sort of belief forming methods you ought to use in the first place, right? It seems to me that if you have sort of a greatest obligation to believe everything written on that paper, right? It seems to me that the degree to which you're justified in accepting that your greatest obligation is to believe everything written on the paper is the degree to which sort of you're epistemically justified in believing it's true that your greatest obligation is to believe everything that's written on this paper. So there's also like a sort of like self-defeat worry there, right? Because if the reason why you accept that your greatest obligation is to believe everything on this paper is because of sort of epistemic reasons, which presumably like that's what it's going to be, because epistemic reasons are sort of like rationally indispensable and incorrigible. So yeah, so like it seems to me that the only reasons that you have for accepting that you have that obligation in the first place is going to be epistemic reasons. But then you're just going to ignore you're just going to ignore all epistemic reasons because you take it that the obligation is stronger. But then the reason why you hold that obligation in the first place is because of the epistemic justifications for it, the reasons that counter in favor of its truth. So it seems to me that there's a self-defeat worry here, and it seems to me just incoherent and misunderstands, like conceptually, what the normative what an epistemic norm is, and the kind of normative force that's baked into it, and the overriding nature that's sort of baked into it in terms of how we ought to form our beliefs.
That's really interesting. Like this belief, it anchors Jim into believing it, such that if he ever does believe it, evidence can no longer change his mind, so long as he's following this principle. Like no amount of evidence can actually change his mind, because evidence only gives epistemic obligations. But in virtue of Jim's beliefs, epistemic obligations are not his greatest obligations. They can't change his mind. So yeah, I'm going to call beliefs
So
like this.
yeah, just to clarify, this is incoherent because epistemic or obligations necessarily they ought to be the kind of obligations that change your mind. That's just how I understand epistemic obligations. They're just overriding obligations until in terms of how you ought to form your beliefs, right? And so this idea that there can be this greatest obligation that you believe in that surpasses all epistemic norms, it seems to me that that's not even coherent, and it seems that there's a self-defeat worry um, in this case, anyways.
Anchor beliefs where, in following the obligation principle, you're locked into believing it. Now, are there any other beliefs out there which we might think are anchor beliefs? So once you believe it, you're kind of anchored into believing it as long as you're following your greatest obligation. Well, yes, I would. Hold on, just trying to find where I am in my notes.
And another point to raise here is that he seems to suggest that there's going to be well, I mean, I've already explained this, but it seems to me that he suggests that there's going to be a sort of conflict, sort of tension between what rationality commands us to do and what morality commands us to do. But this is going to be very controversial, right? Because in a lot of mainstream ethics, morality just is going to be sort of grounded in what rationality commands us to do, right? For example, if you're a Kantian, which is sort of I take myself to be in sort of the neighborhood of a sort of Kantian constructivist, right? If you're a Kantian, then you're going to take it that we arrive at moral truths purely through sort of pure reason, right? Um, or, um, moral truths are going to be grounded in sort of practical reason, right? And there's some motivations for this. Like one obvious one is going to be the formula of the universal law, right? Um, we ought not like we can't will the maxim of say lying without contradiction, right? We can't will the maxim of um, lies as universal law because if lying was sort of a universal law, then everyone would be liars, and our lies couldn't possibly succeed because uh, everyone would know that everything that they're saying is false, right? Um, so the success of our lie presupposes that there's at least some honesty in the world. So there's a contradiction in our goals. On one hand, we have to presuppose that there's honesty in the world, and on the other hand, we're lying. We're lying, right? There's a contradiction in our goals here. I might be sort of explaining myself badly, but that's one sort of route we might take to say that that rationality commands us to act. Another route is you might be more fond of some sort of utilitarian theory, some sort of hedonic utilitarian theory, and you might motivate it as such, right? You might say that rational self-interest agents, when they reflect on their phenomenological states, their phenomenology, um, the kind of states they pick out as the states that they want to avoid are painful states, and the kind of states that they pick out as states that they want to experience, that they want to maximize, are pleasurable states, right? States of pleasure, right? And so from this reflection, this rational reflection, this self-interested reflection of their internal phenomenology, um, they pick out pleasurable states as those states that should be maximized, and um, painful states as those that should be minimized. So it's sort of reflective deliberation, which justifies, which rationally justifies um, uh, you in sort of taking action to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, right? Is sort of one way that we can sort of understand um, in the context of utilitarianism how they would argue that rationality and morality are sort of intertwined, and rationality commands you to sort of maximize pleasure, right, and minimize pain. So that's another route we can sort of take. So um, and I can like run through a million more arguments, but I think you sort of get the point here. The idea that rationality and normative sort of epistemic or sorry moral normativity and irrationality, the idea that there's a conflict there seems to be a sort of false and unjustified assumption that I don't accept, right? And um, further, this idea of like a greatest possible obligation, like suppose I take it that the categorical imperative is the greatest obligation, right? It seems to me that that's true too, right? If I believe in the categorical imperative, that's going to be the highest sort of most basic moral sort of principle, right? We ought not treat rational agents merely as means, right? And that's going to be the sort of strongest moral principle, right? And no other consideration can sort of override that. However, it's not going to be the case that that um, I can't sort of cease believing that the categorical imperative is true, because the degree to which I'm justified in believing that the categorical imperative is true is going to be the degree to which I have good epistemic reasons for and arguments for accepting it as true, right? But if someone comes along and gives me reasons to think it's false and better reasons to think that some alternative view, such as I don't know, some sort of like virtue ethical view, Aristotelian virtue ethical view, or some sort of some form of hedonic utilitarianism, if they give me reasons which suggest that deontology is false and that we should accept utilitarianism instead, well then it seems to me that um, it's going to be the case that my epistemic reasons command me to abandon uh, the categorical imperative and to adopt a sort of utilitarianism or virtue ethics, right? It's not going to be the case that I'm going to be so dogmatically clung to the categorical imperative that no sort of considerations of epistemic reasons can change my mind, right? Even though the categorical imperative is going to be the sort of highest sort of moral principle that override, if it's true, if it were true, it would override all um, other sort of obligations in terms of action, right? Um, but it's not going to be the case that I'm just going to be dogmatically clung to it. That doesn't seem to follow at all, right? It seems to me if someone gives me a good argument to reject the categorical imperative and accept some alternative view, um, that it's going to be the case that I ought to abandon the categorical imperative and accept some alternative view, right? And it seems to me that we're going to have a similar case here. And actually, let's see him finish his argument first.
Yes, okay. So the other thing I would say is an anchor belief is Christianity. Like, if you're a Christian, then you'll know that your greatest obligation is to love God. But like, not just somewhat, but like to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. It literally says this is your first and greatest commandment, and the Bible says greatest obligation right there. So, but loving the Christian God with the totality of your being requires, believing that the Christian God exists, and therefore believing that Christianity is true, or at least believing that the central parts of Christianity are true. And this is a central part of Christianity.
So this is the part of where his argument is. So, um, he's basically saying that our greatest giving Christianity is true, and giving you're a Christian, assuming you're a Christian, and you accept Christianity, so that means you accept that your greatest obligation is to love God, and so any epistemic reason can't convince you to abandon Christianity because, well, I mean, epistemic reasons are just going to be lesser than the greatest possible obligation, which is going to be the obligation to obey God. So the problem with this is, it falsely assumes that, well, it underappreciates the sort of overriding sort of um, nature of epistemic normativity, epistemic norms, right? Epistemic norms just are the highest sort of norms in terms of belief acquisition, right? They just are, right? Um, and his example of um, the truth-hating mob is not a counterexample to that, right? Um, your moral obligation to to take the pill does not erase your epistemic obligation, right? It doesn't make your epistemic obligation go away, right? You have a moral. I agree that you certainly do have the moral obligation to take the pill, right? But that doesn't. But then once you take the pill, you're still going to have the moral the epistemic obligation to believe that the millionth digit of pi is not 7, right? You're still that epistemic obligation isn't going to go away, right? Um, and it seems to me that he's falsely sort of assuming that, right? Um, and yeah, so uh, yeah, so I would say that epistemic norms are just those norms which are going to be completely overriding in terms of belief, what kind of beliefs you ought to have, right? And so, and it seems to me that the only reason he accepts Christianity and the degree to which he's justified in accepting that Christianity, um, and that that he has like this obligation to love God is going to be the degree to which he's justified in accepting that it's true that he got to love God, right? And that's going to be an appeal to sort of epistemic reasons. So yeah, so it seems to me that's going to be the case, right? It's the degree to which he's justified in believing that he got to love God is going to be sort of some sort of epistemic reasons, right? And, like why does he think that it's part of the Christian worldview that he had to love God, right? Well, presumably he's gonna would take himself to justify that with some sort of like textual exegesis, which of course is gonna rely on like sort of epistemic reasons, like such as sort of understanding the sort of revelatory acts of God and sort of ruling out interpretations as consistent or inconsistent with the texts. So that's gonna be a sort of process of reasoning that he has to do before he understands that giving Christianity is true. his greatest obligation is going to be to obey God, right? There's going to be some reasoning, some epistemic reasoning that he has to do first in order to get to that belief, right? So it seems to me that there's going to be a self-defeating worry if he wants to say that that the belief that Christianity is true, that he has the obligation to obey God and love God, is going to be the highest obligation that outweighs any epistemic reasons, right? Because it seems to me that epistemic reasons are the things that brought him to sort of the belief that Christianity is the highest obligation in the first place, right? So there's a self-defeat worry there, and there's the fact that he's sort of, it seems that he's, at least given my conceptual analysis, it seems to me that he's failing to understand um, or to fully appreciate the sort of overriding normative force of epistemic obligations, right? Because epistemic obligations seems to me just are those obligations which outweigh any obligation in terms of belief acquisition, right? The kind of belief structure you ought to have, right? So let's keep going.
Christianity, like, that God has a special status. So by the obligation of principle, you're going to be anchored into believing Christianity, and then there's no way to get out of it. Like no matter how much evidence you're presented that Christianity is false, then you're just going to be presented with mere epistemic obligations to believe Christianity, and that's going to be nowhere near as strong as your moral obligation towards loving God. So you're just locked in there.
So there is actually one way to get out of it, and that is just to like wake up one day without that belief.
Right. So that is like that would be like So sorry, like I'm talking about. That's correct because that's not an action that you're taking. That's something that like happens to you. Like, when we're talking about our obligations and our beliefs, we're talking about like the kinds of things that we're deciding to do. And there is this objection that aliens if aliens came and just like zapped my memories and my mind and then made me believe that God didn't exist, then yeah, I wouldn't be a Christian anymore, or I wouldn't believe that Christianity is true, so I wouldn't have the anchor belief. There's actually a random question. I wonder, like in that scenario, would you go to heaven if you died? Like something that aliens zap your mind, you stop believing in all the Christian doctrine, and then you go to heaven. Anyways, just a random question. Anyways,
yeah, my answer is yes, but
yeah. So then the question is, okay, so maybe that's how deconversion happens in the real world. Like deconversion is just something that happens to us. So like when we have deconversions from like in the real world, it's akin to the aliens zapping us because deconversion is just something that happens to us.
We don't choose our beliefs.
Exactly. So yeah, if you're familiar with like all the debates around Pascal's wager, you're going to be pretty familiar also with all this question of can you choose your beliefs and direct doxastic involuntarism, which in philosophy terms, like for most of them it makes sense. Like compatibilism is it saves syllables to say compatibilism rather the thesis that determinism and free will are compatible. But like direct doxastic involuntarism has more syllables than the thesis that you cannot choose your beliefs. So I don't know why we use that term, but anyways, direct doxastic involuntarism is the thesis we can't choose our beliefs. So where are my notes? Okay. So I think that you can act like I obviously follow like on the side that you can at least somewhat influence your beliefs. Like, well, here's a really trivial example. Like I believe right now that my hand is above my head, and now I don't, and now I do, and now I don't. I'm like totally controlling.
So yeah, I was just sort of counting how many syllables are in direct doxastic involuntarism, and it turns out it's quite a bit of syllables in them, and it does seem that there's actually more syllables in them than the sort of concept that it picks out, which is that we can't choose our beliefs, right? So that is sort of interesting, right? It is sort of interesting that we have like these long ass fucking philosophy terms for such basic concepts.
That's a fairly trivial example. A less trivial example is like choosing what books you're going to read, what kind of content you expose yourself to. There are other ways.
Oh, anyways, he's just talking about he's talking about a response to doxastic voluntarism, response to sort of like Pascal's wager type considerations, which isn't even my preferred response to Pascal's wager, because I take it that that even Pascal diffused that worry, and it certainly isn't the sort of objection that I would run against him. And it's not the objection that I have been running against him.
Ways to choose your beliefs regarding anything, like even political views, philosophical views, you can actually influence whether or not you'll believe something or not. And this argument does entail that if your greatest obligation to love God with the totality of your being would be best fulfilled by like believing in God, then you should actually take proactive measures to believing in God. Like you could pray more, study theology, involve yourself in Christian community. One thing also that like I don't know if this is for everybody, but when I listen to classical music, I kind of feel just like my credence in theism increasing. There's no argument there; just classical music has that effect on me. This does actually lead to another objection though. Like, okay, so you're saying that I should actually like I should take any measure I can to continue to believe in the Christian God because that's my greatest obligation. So does that mean like if I find myself starting to doubt Christianity, I should just find some sort of echo chamber, some sort of Christian community where they never like hear any criticisms and they all just I don't know what echo chamber means. Like, should I go into that community if I find myself starting to doubt Christianity? I mean, my greatest obligation, right? Not going into echo chambers, that's just a mere epistemic obligation. And in response, I would say like, okay, this argument does entail that as a last resort, echo chambers, if they did stop you from deconversion, would be preferable to deconversion. But I mean, you're not in any way like forced to go directly to an echo chamber if you start doubting. And actually, echo chambers make your worldview really fragile. And if you ever run into any criticism of it, rather, you should prefer like ways of maintaining credence in theism that do fulfill both your greatest obligation towards loving God and your epistemic obligations, if possible, like say studying theology or something like that. So
Yeah, there's
Am I
more
coming
healthy
across
ways
clearly?
of dealing with that. Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I would
Okay,
interrupt if it wasn't coming clear. I did want to say though that we're going to take some questions and objections. If you have an objection to anything that's been said so far, let me know in the live chat and I'll pull it up and we'll try to address it in just a few minutes. And then, do you have any more objections that you're going to run through? Because I could give one.
Yeah, I'm gonna go through one more. Okay, Islam. Okay, so
Yeah,
what about
that
Muslims?
was
Can
more.
they use this argument? Because that's a really interesting question. Because like, if I can't leave like Christianity because loving the Christian God is my great.
So he's gonna be sort of addressing the many gods objection to Pascal's wager, and I think that I do think that the many gods objection is sort of an effective objection to Pascal's wager. But he's gonna be addressing the many gods objection, not to Pascal's wager, I should say, but to the sort of argument he made already, well, that he's been making this whole time, I should say. And let's see how he addresses it. I'd be actually kind of curious to see how he does.
Greatest objection. Maybe Muslims should leave Islam because that loving Allah is their greatest obligation. So then it's like, I've just killed all of evangelism because there's like a couple. What's the number? Like 2.2 billion Muslims. And, I've just given an argument that locks them all into Islam. So I actually go back and forth on like, does this objection work? Like, so first we need to distinguish between two kinds of Muslims. Like one thinks that their greatest obligation is to love Allah, like the Muslim God, and like Allah there is a rigid designator. The other view is like a Muslim who thinks that their greatest obligation is to serve the actually existing God, who is Allah. Like in that case, it would be more of an indexical, like who their greatest obligation is towards. With the latter case, they could actually change who they think that the actually existing God is without violating their greatest obligation, and they would change their view of who he is based off of epistemic considerations if they follow this principle. But what about that kind of Muslim who does think that their greatest obligation is to love Allah, but it is a rigid designator who is Allah? Well, I mean, you could just bite the bullet and say, well, yeah, if they follow the obligation principle, there is no way for them to ever become a Christian. But the Holy Spirit's going to convict them and take care of that belief for them because the Christian God actually does exist. So he's going to help get them rid of that belief. Yeah, words. But there's also like this gets complicated. But you might be able to get into like credences in different views, and that might be able to this gets really complicated really fast. But the credence in Islam and the credence in Christianity both like defined rigidly as in your greatest obligation is towards the Muslim God or the Christian God. If your credence starts shifting, like say it's 99% Islam, 1% Christianity, and then it starts to grow, like should the Muslims stop it? Like if it was say atheism, they could say, well, yes, I should stop that credence from growing. I should shrink it back because if it gets too big, I'll have difficulty fulfilling my greatest obligation towards Allah. But with Christianity, like that probability space is screaming, hey, you have an obligation towards the Christian God, so let this probability space grow. And then, but the Islamic probability space is saying, don't let.
So he's basically saying that the Muslim wouldn't be completely irrational um, if they adopt Christianity, because in terms of credences, um, the extent to which the Muslim has a credence in Christianity is going to be the extent to which that there's this sort of probability space which screams out to them that there's this obligation that they might have towards the Christian God. Um, but it seems to me that if we're saying that the Muslim obligation sort of like rigidly picks out a law, well, it seems to me that if that's their greatest obligation, then any obligation towards the Christian God, um, sort of obligation that rigidly picks out the Christian God, is just going to be a lesser obligation, right? Because it seems to me that the whole point of the greater obligation is it's going to be sort of like an obligation that rules out any other possible obligation, right? So it seems to me that any obligation that the Muslim could have for the Christian God is going to be um, smaller, or is going to be like sort of lesser when compared to the obligation that that rigidly picks out that the obligation towards Allah, that rigidly picks out Allah and their love for them, the obligations that they ought to fulfill for Allah. Um, so it seems to me that I don't even think it's going to be the case that epistemic reasons in this case can sort of break the tie, because it seems to me that um, that Allah is that their obligation that rigidly picks out Allah is always going to be sort of stronger than any sort of epistemic reason they can give, and it's also going to be sort of stronger than any obligation that they can possibly have for sort of Yahweh, right? Because it seems to me that that what they're accepting here is that their greatest obligation rigidly picks out their obligation to Allah rather than sort of to Yahweh, right? And that's how he explained it, right? So it seems to me that given on his own view, it's just not going to be the case that the Muslim ought to change their view with ever, right? Um, and it seems to me that that's going to be it's not sort of the objection that I would use, but I would say that it might be a bit of a concern, because especially if you want to be like a sort of Christian missionary, if you're interested in sort of like changing minds, um, uh, trying to get people, so especially like different religions, to convert. Sorry. Um, it seems that this is going to be a sort of difficulty for you, but um, I didn't really sort of run that objection because I feel like the sort of objection that I sort of ran is going to be sort of even is going to be sort of a bigger worry because it seems to me um, this is more than just a minor practical worry. This is him, like it seems to me, not understanding um, the normative force of epistemic norms, and it seems to me that there's a self-defeat worry with the sort of argument that he's running too. Um, so it seems to me that those are much bigger sort of problems than this. But uh, but I think this is a worry too, and I don't think that the way he's addressed it is particularly convincing. Seems to me that the only way out of this is to sort of just bite the bullet, um, and accept that the Muslim could never have any rational reason to accept to abandon their belief in the law, and to accept Christian theism, because it seems to me that any obligation that you can sort of bestow upon them is going to just be lesser than the obligation, which picks out their love, which rigidly designates specifically the Muslim God, the Islamic God, as Allah, right? Right, and it seems to me that any sort of credence that they could have in Christianity is going to it seems to me that that's just going to be a lesser obligation given their view, right? Um, sure, the obligation to obey Yahweh is going to scream out at them, but it's going to be a lesser obligation. So it seems to me that that shouldn't be one that rationally compels them, right? On the Muslims' view, at least.
Let it grow because you have a greatest obligation towards the Muslim God. So maybe epistemic obligations can be a tiebreaker and allow your credences to slide in one direction or the other. But like,
so yeah, this is him suggesting that the epistemic reasons could be a tiebreaker, but I don't understand how that's going to be the case given how given other things he said about how the greatest obligation sort of thing works. Seems to me that I don't think that that's going to work out because um, every if we're accepting that it's the greatest, like the greatest obligation is one that rigidly picks to the law. Seems to me that any other obligation that you could that you can pick to, including any epistemic obligations and uh, obligations that could possibly exist towards sort of Yahweh, are going to be just sort of lesser obligations, which is obviously going to be overridden by the obligation to Allah. So it seems to me that there is no way to make a tiebreaker here. It just seems to me like hopeless, and that Muslim is sort of like trapped and they can never rationally deconvert.
I go back and forth on how this argument should interact between or how this argument affects the interaction of faiths, where both sides believe that there's this being that you have the greatest obligation towards. Okay. Yes.
How else are you doing on your notes?
Yeah, that's basically the end. I have a couple general notes. Like one funny thing is that apologists when discussing the definition of faith, they say that faith is not believing something in the face of opposing evidence. Faith is putting your trust in something that you have good reason to believe. And I'm like, yes. However, this argument does show you should also believe in the face of opposing evidence, which I just think is funny.
What's one thing that this it has kind of brought something explicit that I kind of thought I've always thought in the background.
One thing I thought was I think is sort of a concern here is that seems to me that on Christianity, at least my understanding of Christianity, maybe I'm like totally lost here, but on Christianity, what it teaches is that people should devote themselves to the truth. They should study. They should seek the truth, right? So like sort of blind sort of dogmatism seems to be something that would be discouraged on Christianity. Maybe I'm wrong here, but it seems to me that that's going to be the case. In which case, if the reason sort of you accept Christianity is going to be sort of this sort of blind sort of um, dogmatistic reason that you're just going to ignore all the other evidence, right? Seems to me that that's going to be something that could potentially backfire. Maybe I'm wrong here. Maybe this is just my sort of misunderstanding of Christian sort of teachings, but I myself am a deconverted Christian, right? So seems to me that well that's sort of my understanding of the teachings of Christianity, but I could of course be wrong.
Is that there does seem to be something wrong with ignoring your epistemic obligations, but on the other hand, there do seem to be reasons to maintain your belief in your religious system that you're currently in, right? There's something going on there, and I think that's the conflict between epistemic obligations and moral obligations based on the beliefs that you currently have, like your doxastic set of beliefs currently that you're operating out of. There's the conflict between your epistemic obligations and your moral obligations. That's just really fun to think about. I think that's one of the reasons why this argument is so fun, especially that's the thing is going back to the very beginning of this stream where we were what's happening is that you're presenting an argument with these premises that you can reject. One of those premises is based on this thought experiment about this truth-hating mafia, but then is that the premise that you want to jump off of? Because it does seem like that case, that thought experiment is correct. It seems like you want to just give up belief in whatever the million digital pie is so that you can save your family. That just
so yeah, the reason that seems obvious is because it's not even the case that the epistemic obligation even sort of weighs against um, us choose our obligation to act in a certain way to as to like take the pill anyways, because the epistemic obligation isn't really an obligation in terms of action, right? It's an obligation in terms of like belief, what beliefs um, we should hold, right? Um, and it seems to me that this argument sort of rests on a sort of confusion, um, on which it seems to mistakenly assume that there's this conflict between epistemic obligations and moral obligations, right? Um, when such an obligation doesn't even exist and only is only sort of like is the conflict is sort of like just superficial right there. Because sorry, I'm sort of like getting like really tired right now, so I should probably like end this like soon. Um, I'm just like completely fucking out of it. It's like 2 in the morning, and yeah, I'm just tired. Um, so um, it's not the case that the epistemic reasons count against the moral reasons, unless you take it that the epistemic reasons are pro tanto reasons to act, but in which case it's always going to be the case that moral norms are overriding in terms of action, um, and they always outweigh sort of pro tanto reasons, and sort of epistemic reasons, like sort of belief guiding reasons, are going to be just those reasons which are overriding in terms of like the sort of belief acquisition that you want to have, right? And so there's no real conflict here. Um, we have two types of norms, and both of them are overriding in different domains, and um, there is no the greatest obligation which outweighs all epistemic norms, since that seems to just seems incoherent given like how what I even understand epistemic norms to even be, right? Seems to me that epistemic norms just are those norms which are overriding in terms of belief acquisition.
Seems so obvious. But
Mhm.
then if you accept that and you accept these other, it's going to lead to this super weird conclusion. So like, what's the correct way to view this? What is your like? I guess that's one way to move forward here. Is what is
Yeah.
your take on this? What do you believe about this whole situation?
Right. So, yeah, I was going to get into all of that. Like, basically, I think that the principle, I have it up there, the obligation principle, you always should do the greatest obligation that you believe you have. It basically entails that you can have these sort of beliefs that act as anchor beliefs, and that you can't ever escape it, no matter what evidence you have, as long as you're.
So yeah, I guess I would reject the entire idea of anchor beliefs. I think that um, anchor beliefs are self-defeating, and I'm not even sure it's coherent to even say that anchor beliefs exist, given how I understand epistemic norms. Um, I just don't think that they're coherent, and I think that there's a self-defeating worry here.
You're following it. So that's the interesting part of the argument. That's doing most of the heavy lifting. The rest is just trying to show that Christianity is one such anchor belief. And like attacking that portion of the argument, that's boring. Because like, okay, even if you think that Christianity itself isn't an anchor belief, there are definitely religions out there that are going to be anchor beliefs. So really, what you should probably attack is that. That's clear.
Um, I mean, fair enough. I wouldn't like hang my hat on sort of attacking Christianity as a possibility for a sort of anchor belief. Um, I guess I would just attack the entire idea of anchor beliefs in the first place, and whether they should even enter into our conceptual scheme. And my thesis would just be sort of that they shouldn't.
Clarify, I do think Christianity counts as an anchor belief, but if you like, that's what I'm saying. It's probably not the best premise to attack. So what you should do is attack that. But I don't know like what kind of premise you replace it with. You're going to want to say that no, you can leave Christianity, but in the mafia case, you should still take the pill. I don't know what a premise would look like that could get you both of those.
So the basic idea would be that I think my principle would just be that moral norms are going to be the ones that override sort of all like sort of they're going to be the overriding considerations in terms of action, which means that when we have if we have like a moral obligation to sort of like we can think of it as like a general obligation to like sort of take care of our family and to sort of save lives, like those could be like sort of moral considerations that are going to be sort of overriding considerations. um those moral reasons are going to be overriding reasons to act, and it seems to me that the epistemic reason doesn't in any way count against that, because um, epistemic reasons are just reasons about belief. So it seems to me that in the case of taking the pill, in terms of the truth hating mob case, it seems to me that both of the obligations are there. Um, well, I mean, the obligation, the epistemic obligation, is sort of so. Sorry, let me just think about this for a second. Um, sorry, sort of lost my train of thought there. Um, so, um, the moral obligation um, is sort of is you're going to be your obligation to take the pill, right? And it's not going to be the case that the fact that you fulfilled your moral obligation, then suddenly your epistemic obligation sort of like disappears, right? No, it's going to be the case that um, once you when the situation occurs that the truth-seeking mob kidnap your family, then you're going to have the moral obligation to save your family and take the pill. And then once you take the pill, you're going to still have that epistemic obligation to have true beliefs, right? But then like you taking the pill is going to sort of like force you to like fail with respect to that obligation, right? Um, so it's not the case that the epistemic obligation counts against you having that moral obligation, right? Because epistemic obligations don't guide actions at all. It's just going to be the case that you fulfill your moral obligation and then you fail with respect to your epistemic obligation. Your epistemic obligation doesn't go away at all.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about that myself, and I don't really. I mean, nothing's coming to mind. But like, what a principle would look like that would, yeah, allow one case but then prevent the other. I don't know.
I'm not saying there isn't one out there. I just don't know what it would look like.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
True.
this is pretty much the end of their talk, and I'm pretty sure the rest of the video is going to just be addressing like sort of super chats and stuff. So just to recap, his argument starts out by assuming that there are epistemic and moral norms, which is going to be already controversial if you're an epistemic and moral anti-realist. Of course, I'm not an epistemic and moral anti-realist, so I'm going to just accept that. But even if we do accept that there are epistemic and like moral norms, which I think is going to be something that's going to be fair to accept. Anyways, but in any case, if we do accept true epistemic norms and true moral norms, we're not like an error theorist or a cognitivist or whatever, or expressivist about them, then it seems to me that we can just take it that epistemic norms are going to be those norms which are always going to be overriding in terms of beliefs, in terms of like what kind of beliefs we have to have, and right because epistemic norms are going to be those norms which sort of um, appeal to the sort of belief structure. They're going to be overriding norms in terms of our belief structure, right? Um, and moral norms are going to be those overriding norms in terms of sort of what kind of maxims we ought to endorse, what kind of sort of normative principles we ought to sort of abide by. So that's the way we should think about it, right? Um, and when we think about it that way, it's not going to be the case that there is the greatest obligation which can override all moral obligations and all epistemic obligations, because I take it that epistemic obligations are just going to be those obligations which are always which override all obligations in terms of. I feel like I'm repeating myself at this point, but it just seems to me that it's just obvious that the argument doesn't succeed, and um, I see no reason to accept it. Um, and sort of that's just my problem. Um, Sorry, I'm just really fucking tired right now. I think I'm just gonna end this stream right now. But yeah, I hope